was it that first brought smallpox and gonorrhea and syphilis and measles and the common cold to the Northwest coast and the Northwest natives? Was it a gunner on Captain Cook's ship? Was it the bosun's mate with Captain Vancouver? Was it a harpooner on American whaler? Was it a trader on a Spanish boat? It doesn't really matter, because as soon as the first Europeans appeared, this plague that was just as bad as the one that swept Europe in the Dark Ages swept up and down the Northwest coast just like wildfire. And the thing is, before the Europeans came, these people had a powerful and successful culture, and the key was the sea and the forest provided. They had a mild climate because of this Japanese current offshore. They had halibut, salmon, herring, crab, in addition to all the berries they could ever want. And they had candlefish, which you could dry and burn and light. And in the woods they had giant cedar trees. They could make baskets from cedar trees, clothing. They could make canoes, which they traded up and down the coast with. They could make shelter out of the cedar trees. Their culture had permanent villages. Now, this was rare. Most of the interior tribes were nomadic. If the weather was colder, they had to chase game. But in the Northwest, the typical village was these large multi-family lodges built on a sheltered cove with canoes drawn up on the bank. They were so prosperous that they were able to produce really impressive art. You know, the masks, and which were typically used for dancing, and totem poles, which, these weren't worship. Totem poles were essentially carved history and a culture that didn't really have a written language. So you had this, this really powerful, successful culture. And then when the first sails of the Europeans appeared starting in the 1750s, it all changed. By 100 years later, the culture was basically collapsing. I mean, disease would be spread to these remote villages where white men had never even been. And, whole villages were being abandoned, and some of this spectacular art was just disappearing into the forest. Very fortunately, there was this guy named George Hunt, and he grew up right here. His father was the Hudson's Bay trading post manager. In those days, Hudson's Bay was like a general store, and it was, a critical part of Indian commerce. So not only was it the Hudson's Bay trading post where all the natives came, but there was also a Kwakiutl village there. And so this guy, George Hunt, grew up totally immersed in Kwakiutl culture and coastal native culture. He knew where the great art was, and he had a tremendous appreciation for the art. So remember, these are in the days when there was no internal combustion engine. There were big steamboats that took people around, but to get way up in these remote coves and places, they would have to go by native canoe. So George Hunt, he came and he took these people way up these remote inlets like Kingcombe Inlet. There was a lot of great art up there, and they saved this art that otherwise would have literally disappeared into the forest. And so this art went back to all the big museums, and now, you know, flash forward to the present. Indian culture, Indian society is more prosperous. There's income from fishing, income from logging. There's you know, social government programs that didn't exist before, and now many of these tribes have their own museums. So a lot of this art is slowly being repatriated to the museums of the native tribes. But the thing is, if the collectors hadn't found this guy, George Hunt, who was basically almost a native and knew where all the great art was, this art, much of it would have disappeared into the forest.